think America is such a bad country that we need to be accompanied by a cadre of lies, that we can't look our past straight in the eye, because if we do, our young people will get so turned off that they'll leave or they'll become anti-American.
These monuments deceive us, and they don't tell the stories that I think would restore good values.
The challenge with so many of these monuments is that they leave out more than they illuminate.
A lot of monuments, a lot of historic houses, a lot of museums and so on make us more stupid about history in general and about that event in particular than before we went there.
Hey guys and gals, it's your buddies Drew and Ralphie with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, a lot of times when looking back into history or looking at historic monuments or something like that, you have to, how's it go, read between the lines. So many times when we look back in history, we see not so accurate views or opinions or hypotheses on how historic events actually occurred. But, you know, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it here at the beginning. I'm going to let you guys check out the video. We'll talk afterwards. This stuff is good.
History is sometimes embellished to present stories that fit America's ideological needs. The site of Lincoln's birthplace does this in a couple of ways, beginning with the authenticity of the cabin he was born in.
It's my understanding it's the original cabin. I don't know, it may be a replica, but I understood it was the original.
I think it's important that visitors do know that this may not be the original cabin. I think it's important that they know that we refer to it as a symbolic cabin.
I asked if it was an original, if it was the original cabin, and the answer was that the National Park Service feels like that some of the logs are original. They don't know which ones, but that some of the cabin is original, and that it looks like the cabin that was here. In 1895, a entrepreneur purchased the Sinking Spring farm, Lincoln's birthplace farm, and he hired an agent to go out and put a cabin on it. And so this agent went off and found some cabin that was nearby and not needed, and he put it on the farm. It went off to the Buffalo World's Fair, and there it was on display next to the Jefferson Davis log cabin. Now, Jefferson Davis wasn't even born in a log cabin, but that's okay, never mind. Then after that exposition closed, the guy who invented these two cabins took them off to Coney Island to display them there. But on the trip to Coney Island, the two cabins got commingled. And that didn't stop them. They put up one big cabin, and they called it the Lincoln-Davis Log Cabin. And presumably they were both born there, I guess, on separate days. Finally, a wealthy magazine publisher bought the farm, speaking literally, and he hired a famous American architect to devise a suitable temple, really, to put the cabin in. But when they did, they found, alas, the architect had miscalculated, and the temple was too small. The architect knew just what to do. He had the cabin cut down in size. So this cabin, which was built to the approximate right dimensions of normal pioneer cabins, we don't know the precise dimensions of Lincoln's, but is now 2/3 as big as it should be. And all it does is it makes for a bigger story because it's a smaller cabin.
Chiseling to the monument itself, there are the words, "Here, over the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born."
I think at the time that the cabin was placed in the memorial, it was truly believed that that was the correct cabin. And today, after additional research, I think it's understood that there's just not enough documentation to support the authenticity, and that's why the Park Service refers to it as being symbolic.
A more serious issue involves Lincoln's role in freeing black slaves during the Civil War.
All my life as a child, that's all I ever heard, that Lincoln freed the slaves. You look at sort of iconography in Harper's Magazine and the like, and Lincoln frees the slaves.
The textbooks will say, well, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was the great emancipator, and that's how blacks won their freedom.
What is really important is that the public recognize that Lincoln played a role in the freeing of the slaves, but that the slaves played a major role in freeing themselves.
Blacks won their freedom because for 30 years before the Civil War, they participated in a great movement of resistance. Well, resistance in the South, underground railroads, fighting the Fugitive Slave Acts, disobeying the law. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were the key players in the great movement for the abolition of slavery.
And I think by not accepting that notion, you create an environment where people begin to think, well, African Americans have always had things handed to them. It gets carried into the notions of welfare and the like. But if you then change that and you say, wait a minute, African Americans played a major role in their own freedom, and more importantly, a major role in helping the North win the Civil War. That changes the way people will come to thinking about African American culture.
When you look at a monument, a memorial, you don't want to just read the words, important as they are. Sometimes what the artist is doing, sometimes the images make more of an impact than the words.
Monuments are created to be dramatic, and by being dramatic, sometimes there's a great need to embellish. There's a great need to sort of create a sense that this is a larger-than-life individual or larger-than-life story. I just feel very strongly that while that's important for people to be able to find their heroes, I just don't think we need to do the embellishment. I think the stories are strong enough.
All across the United States, we see white explorers, or discoverers, as they're incorrectly called, towering over Native Americans who are often seated or lying down or at least well below in the scale of things. We also see conquerors just depicted huge on big, tough horses, horses that never were. So the scale an artist uses, the business of who's on top and who's strong, that can just make us think, well, yes, of course it happened this way.
The best monuments should be able to tell complex stories, but that means that the design has to both be visual as well as educational.
Monuments don't usually encourage you to stand back and say, did this happen like this?
Monuments often make Native Americans out to be naive without any concept of commerce. The monument memorializing the purchase of Manhattan by the Dutch for $24 worth of beads typifies this myth. It stands in Battery Park on the southern tip of the island of Manhattan.
Think about this monument. The first thing that's amazing now is just to look at it. What do we see? We see this nearly naked Native American and this fully clothed, even with a jacket on, Dutchman. Now, I've been to New York City in August, and I can tell you that if this purchase that never took place in August, that is one hot Dutchman. I've been to Manhattan in February, and I can tell you if this purchase that never took place in February, that's one cold Indian. So what we're really seeing is we're seeing primitive and civilized. And the whole story is really about poor, stupid, primitive. Those Indians, they didn't even know what land is worth. I mean, $24 won't buy you a postage stamp worth of Manhattan today. Second of all, the Dutch never gave beads to anybody as far as we can tell. This statue, of course, shows them with some beads dangling that they're giving to the Indian. What the Indians wanted and what they got was stuff they couldn't make themselves, particularly metal kettles, steel axes, steel knives, guns, and brightly colored woven wool blankets. So for some fee, maybe something like $2,400 as far as I can tell, worth of this stuff, the Dutch bought Manhattan from the Canarsies. They bought it from the wrong tribe. Now, you can go to Canarsie, you can go to it on the subway. When you come up, you are in Brooklyn. In fact, you're in East Brooklyn at the end of the line. That's where the Canarsies lived. Why shouldn't they sell Manhattan? Wasn't theirs. For centuries thereafter, Europeans bought land from the wrong tribe, or they set up two factions within a tribe, and they bought it from one faction, bribed them, paid those folks a whole bunch of stuff, and then there'd be maybe a civil war or a war between two different Native American groups. Therefore, the French or the British or the Dutch didn't have to fight the natives. They were fighting each other, and meanwhile, the land ended up in European hands.
American mythology has been suggested as a possible alternative to simply American history. And of course it would be true. It's certainly not the history of working people who are most of the American population. It's a history of the people who have been in power in this country for a very long time. So, yes, we could use a truly American history.
History is without a doubt the only subject that the more you study it, the dumber you get. College professors in math are delighted if you've had more high school math. They'll put you in an advanced math course. But in history, this is not so. You have to break the icons, you have to break down the mythology, the lies, if you will, that you learned in high school and even in middle school and elementary school. You're really better off if you didn't learn them in the first place.
I would argue there's an awful lot of opportunities to use history to understand educational policy, urban development, to understand industrial growth and change. So in some ways, without using history, the policymakers in this country are solving the problems with one hand tied behind their back.
We might think about what are the functions of public history. I think the biggest single function is to rouse the public to a state of patriotism, or maybe better put, nationalism. And this doesn't necessarily mean nationalism for the country as a whole. Maybe it's better put, nationalism for the cause that is being celebrated here.
Across the country, civic leaders have paid tribute to Christopher Columbus by naming streets and cities after him, and by putting up statues.
I learned in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and we made little milk pint, ships, and it wasn't even until college that I learned the truth about it.
We discovered America in 1492, and I think it's appropriate that we recognize him for Italian Americans for what they've done for our country.
his true significance doesn't come from 1492. He didn't do anything in 1492 that Leif Erikson hadn't done in 1002 or so. It comes from 1493, because in 1493, this man persuades the King and Queen of Spain to outfit him with 17 ships, with between 1,000 and 2,000 soldiers, with 20 dogs, attack dogs, with horses, with armor, and he proceeds to take over the island of Haiti and rename it Hispaniola. Now, this had never been done before in human history, for one country to maintain and conquer a country on the other side of an ocean. This was a first.
When he came in there, on our country, he came to steal.
Columbus worked a marvelous deal with the King and Queen of Spain. He was to get 10% of all the riches he brought back from the, quote, New World, but he also was to get 10% of everything everybody else brought back. So it was a great deal. He wasn't able to enforce it all. They changed the contract terms unilaterally, but he did become rich.
But Columbus ran into a problem during his first visit to the New World. He couldn't find the huge gold deposits that he promised to his investors.
So the drive to satisfy the profits of his financiers drove him to awful acts. He punished the Indians who wouldn't bring him enough gold. He hacked off their arms. He killed them. And when he couldn't find enough gold, he enslaved them and brought them back in chains to Spain. He had to show his patrons something that represented wealth, if not gold, human wealth.
Christopher Columbus started the transatlantic slave trade. Now you have to understand the transatlantic slave trade began from west to east. It was a trade in Native Americans, or Indians, taken across the Atlantic to be enslaved in the Azores, in the Canary Islands, and in Spain itself. And the only reason it didn't work is because Native Americans were not immune to the diseases that were already common in Europe and Asia and Africa. Everybody in Europe knew that the world was round. The Catholic Church held it to be round. Sailors especially know it to be round. And there's this whole mythology about Christopher Columbus had to face down a near mutiny from his sailors who were afraid of sailing off the edge of the flat earth. This mythology, it turns out, was established by none other than Washington Irving in about 1830. He's the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He's a novelist. Well, in 1830 or so, he wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus. 3 volumes. It was the most popular biography of the 19th century, stayed in print throughout the century. And he told the story, the flat earth story. So the world did not become flat in 1491 just before Columbus sailed. The world became flat in 1830.
This map of the round world was commissioned by the Pope to be translated from Greek into Latin in Florence, Italy in 1410, 82 years before Columbus set sail. In Columbus's right hand is a decree. The words are chiseled into the base of the statue. By the grace of God, and in the name of Her Majesty Queen Isabella, I am taking possession of this land, October 12th, 1492. Spain and Columbus got their authority to take the property and the lives of non-Christians from a papal decree called the Doctrine of Discovery. The Pope cut a deal with Spain and Portugal. He divided the world in half by drawing a line on a map and gave title of the Eastern Hemisphere to Portugal and the Western Hemisphere to Spain.
Well, this wasn't a deal that Denmark agreed to or that England agreed to, and so France and England and Holland and Denmark, they want in on the deal, and they all steal and take over various parts of the Americas. It was the first great imperialism in the history of the world.
At the top of the pedestal, an inscription says, "To Christopher Columbus, discoverer of America."
Christopher Columbus never reached North America. The only part of what is now the United States that he reached was Puerto Rico.
So in 1492, there were some 100 million natives living in the Americas. Should they be credited with discovering America instead of Columbus?
Yeah, I suppose they should be. Problem is, we don't have a date in when they came over, so it's easier to celebrate, Christopher Columbus and when he came over.
About 25 years ago, a batch of Native Americans tried to make this point, and I think they did make it. Adam Nordwall, who is an Ojibwa Indian, and some other Native Americans, took an Alitalia flight to Rome, and they discovered Italy.
Here's my opportunity to go over to a land where the doctrine of discovery originated from, the Vatican. And the idea was to lay claim of discovery of their country, of Italy. Just to turn things completely around, I stuck a spear in that ground, proclaiming my discovery of this new land for the American Indian people. When I'm introduced to the Pope, he's standing there, and I'm walk forward in measured steps. And as I walk slowly toward him, he raises his hand with this big, beautiful ring on it. Well, I understand what that's all about. And as he raises his hand to me, I raise my hand to him. And I'm wearing a big, beautiful ring. Now, there's an audible gasp in the Vatican because here's their two guys holding their rings out to each other to kiss. The cardinals, the bishops, the Pope's aides, there's going to be an international incident between His Holiness and the Indian. And the Pope broke the ice. And one of the things he said to me, I've read a great deal about the American Indian people, and I know what you are doing.
Did your meeting with the Pope resolve the issues between Native Americans and the Catholic Church?
No, because the Vatican never apologized to Native Americans for the crimes committed in the name of the Church against our people.
Today is Columbus Day, a national holiday set aside to honor the explorer who 512 years ago made landfall in the West Indies. It's a day in which Italian Americans take special pride and others take exception.
Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa, Italy. He sailed from Spain in 1492 with the blessing of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. After numerous attempts to convince Queen Isabella that to reach India in the east, one could sail towards the west. Since he noticed that a ship's mast was the last visible sign of a ship in the horizon. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria took more than 2 months. He set sail on August 3rd, 1492 from Palos, Spain. Columbus's first impression of Native Americans was very favorable.
Welcome back. It's like I was saying at the beginning, a lot of times when we look back in history, well, it's not as clean cut, as accurate as we once thought it was. The more historians look back into the happenings that occurred in the past, we come to find out that certain liberties were taken. Certain things aren't exactly like we thought. I kind of really have to agree with the historian, in the video, that the more we study history, the dumber we get. We look into the historic happenings and we find all these different accounts, all these different stories, and it kind of makes you wonder which one is real, if any of them. I guess truth is what we make it. But I hope you guys enjoyed this look at some monumental historic myths. Kind of makes you wonder. Huh? But that's all we got for you guys today. As always, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. And we'll see you in history.